The Vethrani Concordat maintained the most complete xenological archive in the known galaxy for 4,000 years. I know this because I spent 11 years cataloging what remained of it. They are gone now, the Vethrani, the Concordat, the archive's original keepers. What survived is a partial record, 3.4 million indexed entries on crystalline substrate, covered from the debris field of their third administrative station by a compact salvage team. Approximately 2 centuries after the station went silent. The compact acquired the archive formally, filed it under the charter designation Recovered Institutional Record, Origin, Vethrani Concordat, classification status, sealed pending review, and assigned a small historical division to assess it. I was the third historian assigned to the project. The first 2 had retired before completing the review. I understood why, by the time I finished, the Vethrani were methodical. That is not a criticism. Every species the compact has absorbed or outlived had its own characteristic mode of thought, and the Vethrani's was taxonomy. They classified everything. They had formal designation, categories for stellar phenomena, biological life at every stage of complexity. For civilizational development from pre-tool to multi-system, their archive was not a library in the way most species use that word. It was a ledger. Every entry carried a classification code, a resource potential rating, a threat assessment index, and a management recommendation. The management recommendation was the column that interested me most because it was the one the Concordat actually acted on. I found the human entry in the archive's 4th subchamber. Filed under a classification tier the Vethrani used for what their notation system called active developmental subjects, species they were monitoring with the intention of eventual contact or, if the threat assessment index warranted it, preemptive intervention. The human entry was cross-referenced to 1,847 supporting documents. I read all of them. It took 8 months. The Vethrani had been watching humanity for approximately 6,000 years before the event I am describing. They had watched from a careful distance, passive observation only, lay stations seated at intervals in uninhabited systems at the edge of what is now the advisory margin. The observation record was detailed. The Vethrani had documented human technological development, human territorial expansion, human conflict patterns, human resource acquisition rates. Their analysts had filed summary assessments at regular intervals across those 6 millennia. The early assessments were clinical and moderately concerned. The later assessments were also clinical, and considerably more concerned. The management recommendations had not changed. The final management recommendation in the human entry read, in the Vethrani administrative dialect as follows: classification, manageable asset, threat index, elevated but bounded, recommended action, continued passive observation with standing directive for intervention if expansion crosses threshold, coordinate at 7 volumes. I want to be precise about that classification, manageable asset. I want to be precise because the Vethrani were precise. They did not use language carelessly. When they wrote manageable, they meant it in the way an engineer means it about a mechanical system. A system whose behavior can be predicted, whose outputs can be bounded, whose trajectory can be redirected by the application of sufficient external force at the correct moment. They had a long history of applying that force to other species. It had worked in most cases. The archive contained 43 prior examples of successful intervention in what the Vethrani called developmental subject trajectories. The archive was equally candid about the 7 cases where intervention had not gone as calculated. Those 7 were filed under a separate subchamber with a different notation: subject reclassified, designation retired, record sealed. I should have understood what that meant earlier. I did not. I was a historian, and I was reading forward through the record rather than backward from the outcome. And historians are not always wise about the difference. The threshold coordinate set 7, Voss, was crossed in what the Vethrani calendar rendered as year 14,302 of the Concordat's 3rd administrative era. The Concordat's Senior Analytical Council convened within 4 days of the crossing being logged at the relay stations. The meeting record is in the archive, and it is one of the most precisely documented 48 hours of deliberation I have ever read in any institutional record. The council reviewed the development projections. They reviewed the Threat Assessment Index, which had been revised upward 3 times in the preceding century. They reviewed the 43 successful prior interventions and the 7 tired designations. Then they issued the directive. It was not a war declaration. The Vethrani did not issue war declarations. That was not their mode. It was a management directive, formal, procedural, filed in the correct administrative tier, with the correct authorization codes, and the correct notation in the subject's entry. Management intervention authorized. Threshold criteria met. Enforcement directive issued. Fleet deployment logged. 612 vessels. I found the fleet manifest in the subchamber adjacent to the council meeting record. The Vethrani had assembled what their logistical division assessed as a force 3 times the theoretically necessary minimum for the intervention's objectives. They believed in margin. The fleet was not a war fleet in the sense most species would recognize. It was a tool fleet, designed, equipped, crewed for the specific task of redirecting a developmental subject's trajectory. They had used similar fleets before. They knew how to use them. The fleet departed. The departure logs are in the archive. The transit logs, covering the approach to the advisory margin's inner boundary, are in the archive. There are 31 days of log transit data, methodical and unremarkable, the kind of record a competent fleet produces when it is proceeding on schedule toward a known objective. There are no logs after day 31. I do not mean the logs were damaged, or corrupted, or lost in the salvage recovery. I mean the archive contains an entry where the logs stop, and then a notation, and then nothing. The notation was not written in Vethrani administrative dialect. I had the Compact's linguistic division examine it. It was written in a notation system that does not correspond to any language in the Compact's archive by any species living or extinct. The notation covered in its original substrate dimensions approximately the same space as a single line of standard administrative text. The linguistic division's best assessment, after 18 months of analysis, was that it was a reclassification entry. The equivalent, in Vethrani administrative structure, of updating a subject's file. The subject had been reclassified. The designation had been changed. Spent the last 4 months of my assignment attempting to determine what the new designation meant. I did not succeed. The notation system has no cross-reference in any known linguistic database. The Compact's analytical teams have been working on it since I submitted my report. They have been working on it for 9 years. I do not expect they will find an answer before I retire. And I do not expect my successors will find one either. Some records are not written to be read by the people who find them. They are written to be filed and preserved and understood in a different way, not as a puzzle to solve but as a boundary marker. A notation on a map that means, here is where the map was redrawn, and the party doing the redrawing was not us. What I do know is this. The Concordat's Senior Analytical Council never met again after issuing the enforcement directive. The archive ends there. Not with a final entry. Not with a dissolution record. Not with the kind of administrative closure a function institution produces when it concludes its work. It simply stops, the way a voice stops, when the speaker is no longer present to continue speaking. The third administrative station was found by the Compact salvage team in a debris field that the salvage report describes as consistent with rapid structural failure from an unidentified external cause. The cause remains unidentified. The salvage team noted, in the appendix of their recovery report, that the debris field contained no evidence of any Vethrani vessel having departed the station in the period preceding the failure. The station's complement, crew, administrative staff, the council members who had been resident during the deliberations, had not left. There was no record of them leaving. There was simply no record of them at all. I submitted my completed archive review to the Compact Xenological Authority with one administrative recommendation. I requested that the human entry in the Vethrani archive be reclassified under Compact Charter, its current designation of recovered institutional record, pending review to a permanent designation of sealed, review complete, access restricted. I also requested that the Compact Standard Xenological Catalog entry for humanity be amended in one specific column, the Management Recommendation column. The current entry, inherited from a survey assessment, filed approximately 400 years ago by a species that no longer exists, reads, "Continued passive observation recommended." I recommended changing it to a single word. The word I recommended is the same word the Vethrany's 7 prior retired designations use. The notation in that separate subchamber, under the heading Reclassified. The Compact's Xenological Authority approved the amendment without comment and filed it in the catalogue's restricted tier. I do not know what the word means in the notation system that wrote it into the Concordat's archive. I know what it means in every language I have ever read. It means do not try to manage this. Not again. Not ever. The column has been updated. The advisory margin stands. The Compact's relay stations maintain their passive watch at the 40 light-hour perimeter, logging and reporting and doing nothing more. That is the correct posture. The Vethrany were the most thorough classifiers the galaxy had produced in 4,000 years of recorded xenological history, and the last classification they attempted was the only error anyone who knew them ever attributed to them. One error, one fleet, one notation written in a hand no one has been able to read. That is sufficient.